Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Creating a Roadmap to Working Capital Acceleration with S2P, brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by PRGX. We have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. If you have any technical questions or issues using the WebEx platform, please use the chat box and I will respond right away. If you have any issues with audio, please click on the phone icon above the chat window to receive the teleconference info. For those that do call in, to ensure call quality, everyone's lines have been muted. If you happen to get disconnected, you can log on again using the instructions provided in your webinar confirmation email. If you continue to experience difficulty, please email webinars@iofm.com and we will respond as soon as we can. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box and hit send to submit them. At the end of the presentation, we will have our presenters answer these questions. We will have 3 polling questions during the webinar. A pop-up box will appear when we run each poll. Please choose from the multiple choice answers and hit submit. We'd love to have your participation and insight. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a thank you email with the on-demand materials within 2 business days. Our first speaker today is Marc Brousseau, President of Brousseau & Associates. Over the past 26 years, Marc has established himself as a thought leader on accounts payable, accounts receivable, payments, and document automation. A popular speaker at industry conferences and on webinars and podcasts, Brousseau advises prominent end users and service providers on how to use automation to improve document and payment-driven business processes. Brousseau has chaired numerous educational conferences and has served on several industry committees and boards. He resides in Center City, Philadelphia with his wife and 3 sons. We will also have Vijay Parekh, Director of Strategic Accounts at PRGX. Vijay is PRGX's Senior Director of Delivery for Contract Compliance in the EMEA region. He has over 18 years' experience conducting audits for large global companies across many sectors. At this time, I'd like to welcome our speakers and hand the webinar off to Vijay.
Thank you very much, Jovi, and welcome everyone to our session today, which is titled Creating a Roadmap to Working Capital Acceleration within Source-to-Pay. So today I'm going to explain how you can accelerate cash across Source-to-Pay, how a 3-pillar approach can deliver the fastest path to value, how to supercharge your results from synergies between the 3 pillars, a look at some actual case studies, and then summarizing on the key takeaways from today. So in my role, I get to talk to many CFOs and CPOs about their challenges in the current environment. And what is common in today's world isn't too much different to what was common at the back end of 2019. Everyone wants to improve their working capital, generate more margin, and improve cash flow. Today, we're going to look at how your organization can benefit from leveraging a 3-pillar approach across Source-to-Pay. Before we do that though, let's just run a quick poll if we can, using the interactive options that should appear soon. So the question I've got here is which, if any, of the following areas feature as an objective for your organization over the next 6 to 12 months?
And our options are improving working capital, reducing cost or overhead, or maximizing profitability. Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we'll discuss the results in just a moment. So when you're talking to senior finance executives, Vijay, what's on their minds these days?
So, as we've mentioned, post-COVID, there's been a lot of I suppose, review of past processes and really are they fit for the future? And some of those are, are we being more agile? Have we got the right relationships with our suppliers in place? What can we do to not just help our suppliers but help our organization to be better partners, I suppose, but also improve sort of payment terms, and also, sort of supplier contracts to ensure, supply chain going forward. So, there's been a multitude and a mixture of, let's say, post-COVID reflections, if I may say so. Because I think pre-COVID it was, business as usual, delivering cost savings, etc., etc. I think post-COVID, a lot of organisations have had to rethink and reposition, some of their sort of internal priorities, but also their relationships with their suppliers.
So against that backdrop, how should AP and P2P leaders recalibrate their priorities?
So I suppose, working capital and cash for the business is always really important because, as most organizations, it's a fundamental sort of requirement to have a strong sort of balance sheet, I suppose. So, wherever you can leverage, improving and increasing working capital for your organization, I think will have, huge benefits for, your organization, and also as, for your P2P function.
We asked our attendees which, if any, of the following areas feature as an objective for your organization over the next 6 to 12 months. 38% of our attendees identified improving working capital as a priority. 1/3 of our attendees said reducing cost and overhead. 1/4 of our attendees said maximizing profitability is a key objective. It seems to me that improving working capital would be critical as we try to navigate the recession and position ourselves for the recovery. I've got to ask though, Vijay, in your mind, how good a job were most companies doing at managing their working capital before the pandemic? Were they doing a good job, or did they have a lot of room for improvement?
Well, do you know what, Mark? I think there's been a real mixed experience in our sort of, I suppose, world. That we provide our services to our clients. I mean, some have been doing most of what I'll be talking about in a short while in terms of there are 3 different pillars. Others have been doing some of the more traditional elements, of obviously looking at payment terms, looking at ways of detecting errors within their processes, etc. So I wouldn't say there's been any real significant let's say similarities across organizations. I mean, you wouldn't believe, Mark, but there are still some organizations out there which, one of the first pillars that I'll be talking to today is about doing accounts payable audit sort of review, if you like. And there are still some large organizations out there who don't have any of these type of programs in place. Compounding that with, there are organizations which are still on multiple ERP systems, which again causes disconnects and, it opens up the exposure for, let's say, losing cash from the business, through, payment errors, etc. So, not the most sort of straightforward answer in the sense that, we can see a pattern, but there, like I said, there are, a very mixed approach, but, by and large, a lot of companies are doing the most sort of, let's say, the simpler forms. But hopefully with what we've got today on our agenda, we'll give you some ideas in how you could put some things in place for your organization for the next few months.
So now that we better understand the priorities of our attendees today, why don't you walk us through some of the challenges you see businesses facing in this new reality, Vijay?
Sure, thanks, Mark. So let's look at some of today's challenges that we typically see. So during normal times, most businesses focus on improving working capital, reducing costs, and maximizing profitability. So no some real big surprises there, right? So we probably all want to improve liquidity in the short term, reduce costs, and de-risk for the longer term across source to pay. And COVID-19 hasn't necessarily changed that outlook, but it has accelerated the thinking on multiple streams of activity. And transformation has been necessary to allow businesses to adapt and thrive in today's environment. So what we want to discuss today is how you can drive more value in a shorter time frame by utilizing synergies in a 3-pillar approach to accelerate liquidity and working capital in your organization by focusing on accounts payable, DPO or days payable outstanding, and your contractual relationships with your suppliers. So how can you do that, and what do we mean by the 3-pillar approach? I'll go into this into more detail on the following slides, but for now, what we're talking about here are the following. So the pillar one is looking at the accounts payable transactions to identify incorrect payments on unreconciled amounts and statements that are due, and on statements that are due back to you. Secondly, a detailed review of actual payments versus agreed terms and modelling to explore how you can increase working capital by optimising DPO. And thirdly, a programme of forensic audits of selected suppliers to identify overcharges relating to contract terms and conditions. And really the highlight here is that adopting a three-pillar approach is what we really like to call the fast track to value. There are clear synergies that can be gained by adopting this approach, such as the data required to perform each review and cross-functional stakeholder engagement. And we think that adopting this approach and value should start to be realised within 30 to 60 days. So let's focus on each pillar in a bit more detail. Accounts payable transactions. Every business processes thousands or millions of transactions every year, and inevitably some of these transactions are incorrectly paid. Our experience points to an error rate of between 0.02% and 0.08% of spend. So the percentages may sound small, but think about the spend within your organisation and what that could mean in terms of numbers. Outputs from the review include cash back to the business, with first results typically within 30 to 60 days, an uplift to the bottom line, and crucially, actionable insights to highlight where processes can be improved. This is the foundational element of our three-pillar approach. And the data required to perform this review will be provided as a base for each of the other pillars. Insights from this review can also provide a feed into the DPO modelling and also the contract compliance reviews. Pillar 2 is about DPO. Leading on from the accounts payable review, the same data you aggregated will enable you to review when you are actually paying your suppliers versus the terms you've agreed with them. This will enable you to do two things. Firstly, identify unrealized discounts that you should have taken or should be taking. And then secondly, use modeling to optimize your terms and generate significant realizable improvement in working capital across groups of suppliers, maybe in direct and direct category, or perhaps across category related or across the whole supplier base. From our experience, we see that for every $4 billion of spend, we find on average a delta of 17 days where suppliers are being paid early. And that roughly equates to an average of a 25% uplift in working capital. So that's a bit like lending your vendors $1 billion interest-free for 17 days. That equates to $47 million in working capital that you can recapture and $2.8 million in cost of capital saved, using a 6% rate as a cost of money rate, as an example. Finally, pillar 3, contract compliance. Most of our clients progress this pillar after an accounts payable review because the supplier intelligence and knowledge gained from analysing the data received provides a really good pointer as to which suppliers and contracts should be prioritised for review. This is a deep dive into whether suppliers are charging as per your contracted terms, which you probably invested significant time in negotiating. The purpose of each review is to ensure compliance and ensure that you are getting full value from the operation of your contract. Once you've selected suppliers for review, we would suggest targeting around 10 to 15 audits for the first wave. However, senior executive sponsorship is important as any involvement may be required from procurement and finance. Once again, we are conscious that businesses have little bandwidth currently, and that's why we would employ our own in-house planning and coordination team to help manage the project end-to-end and the audits right the way through to completion and cash realization. So
And that brings,
Mark.
yeah, that brings us to our next poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. Vijay just discussed the 3 pillars as possible approaches an organization can adopt to accelerate value in its S2P function. Has your organization implemented any of these initiatives, past or present? Have you implemented accounts payable audit? Have you implemented payment terms or days payable outstanding? Or have you implemented contract compliance and recovery? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen. And we'll discuss the results in just a moment. Vijay, I have to imagine that someone listening in right now is thinking to themselves, boy, we have a lot on our plate just keeping up with this new reality that we're operating in on. Why should any of these jump to the top of our list of priorities? How would you respond to that question?
No, it's a great question, Mark. I mean, like we mentioned just earlier, a lot of organizations are really, struggling with bandwidth and, obviously introducing new projects or let's say opportunities to try and, improve cash flow and working capital, et cetera, et cetera. These are new projects, which, obviously they're great to do and great ideas to think about, but, actually, executing them, finding a vendor, finding a provider that can actually help you do these is part of the challenge and part of the process. And I suppose this is kind of where PRGX have been doing this for over 50 years. And, we have developed methodologies. We've got so we're a world-class audit team in a profile globally as well. So, I guess truly, working within this industry, within source to pay for many, many years, and across multiple clients has allowed us to understand what the challenges are, but also more importantly, what do we actually need to turn this round? And I think the title, what it says is, creating a roadmap and an accelerated path, to working capital optimization is really truly, what this is about and how can we do that? And I think, the 3 pillars that we spoke about, are what we feel are the most easiest ways and the fastest track, if you like, to doing that. And, without the, extended complications in looking at lots of different, detailed projects, using, and we'll talk about the data in a minute, in a few slides, but, how can you achieve this using minimal data, but get maximal output really is what we're looking at here.
How resource intensive are these activities?
So again, we have our solutions, if you like, or services are end to end. So, from the point that you engage PRGX, obviously there's going to be some amount of data requirement or data pull from your ERP systems. But realistically, once we have that, it's all over to us. Then we do all of the planning, the scheduling, the analysis. We have our own teams that go and do all the investigation into your ERP systems to do all the validation, and actually even reaching out to the suppliers to, let's say looking on the accounts payable side, validating those potential errors within your system. Once they've been identified and validated, we actually help to recover that cash back. And, it's a truly end-to-end service, and very little resource pull, if you like. And I guess on the contract compliance side, which is I would say the other end of the scale, but, the pillar 3, it needs a bit more input from other departments like procurement and perhaps people within the business that own that relationship. But I'd say the value opportunity on the scale, and you'll see that in one of the slide graphs next, is way X number of times more than the AP, because there's a lot more learnings and insights to be had, from doing a contract compliance audit. So,
I see that more than 1/3 of our attendees say they've done an accounts payable audit, but I wonder if the type of audit that many of these organizations have performed is what you're envisioning as being what they ought to be doing. Do you think there might be a disconnect? And what is it that an appropriate AP audit should include?
So an AP audit, traditionally would include looking for things like duplicate payments, statement reviews, etc. And I suppose this is kind of where, it's important to have knowledge, if you like, or be aware of what else can be done with that same accounts payable data? So beyond just looking at the standard duplicate payments, etc., having an opportunity to clean your vendor master file, looking at, let's say, misposted sales tax or VAT, if you call it that, and lots of other different areas. I mean, we can run analytics for you on that data to see whether you've got multiple supplier accounts which are connected through all sorts of different metrics and parameters, like the same bank account numbers or the same locations, etc., where there might be different company entities and so on. So there's a lot more that you can leverage if you're working with a right partner who can bring those potential opportunities and value insights. So as I said, traditional audits have been more, give us the data, we'll, get you back as much value as you can. But, with a partner like, for example, like PRGX, we can go way beyond that by looking at, looking at your payment terms, looking at, your contract compliance or vendor contract compliance against the agreed terms and conditions. Again, all leveraging that same accounts payable data. What's interesting to me, Mark, sorry if I may, option B here, which is really, has your organisation implementing these activities, the payment terms and the DPO obviously is scored quite highly on here. So it's great to see, in that sense.
It's interesting because we've seen skyrocketing growth in electronic payments over the past year. And yet until this poll, I didn't sense that a lot of organizations were taking a hard look at their payment terms or their DPO. That's a big missed opportunity for organizations that push toward electronic payments and then don't adjust their payment terms at the same time. No?
No, yeah, it is true. It's a really big missed opportunity, and I guess unless you have a vendor or provider who's looking at that for you and always coming to you, with opportunities in terms of how you could leverage this, the same AP data to say, look, hey, here's how you're performing in terms of your payment terms with your suppliers, but here's what you signed up to, and there's where the opportunity exists. And an example I gave earlier, about how it equates to in terms of the dollars, where it kind of equates to roughly $1 billion interest free for 17 days. Depending upon the vendors, etc. But it can all add up quite quickly.
We know that there's a lot of AP leaders on the line today, and it might be tempting for them to think that payment terms and DPO is somebody else's responsibility. Why should AP leaders be concerned about payment terms and DPO, and how do they engage their other stakeholders in having these discussions, and what should they be saying?
I guess with a lot of these I'd say value opportunities is about how long is it going to take, what data do we need, what's going to be the ROI on these activities, and what can the business gain, and I suppose these are all the answers that we can present by giving you the insights from the data. So you ask about how can you take this to the business, how can you demonstrate this? I mean, it's really by putting down the hard factor numbers on the table, but that can only be done by looking at the whole mass of data. I suppose one thing which I also want to mention is there are very few organizations, let's say, that can take data from multiple ERP systems. I mean, everybody knows, we've got your big ones like Oracle, SAP, etc. But, what about all the disparate systems and the proprietary systems that you might have within your organization? And, taking all of that information, all that data, agglomerating it all together, and then running all the insights on that, but with a specific focus on, what we've spoken about is the fast track to cash optimization. This can all be done by a provider who, like us, and we process, terabytes of data, for suppliers, and it's for sort of clients, and giving them insight in many different ways. So I suppose back to your question about what can you do and how do you do this? Well, it's really by exposing all of the data to us, allowing us to analyze and assess that, but then coming back to you with all the potential opportunities that are on the table.
I was interested to see the 17% of our attendees who identified contract compliance as something that they have implemented in their organization. For years, VJ, we talked about two-way and three-way matching, right? This idea of matching invoices against POs and against proof of delivery documents. Now we're hearing about four-way matching, where we're bouncing it up against contract data as well. How close are we to the day where contract compliance becomes a standard part of our AP approval processes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see, we're actually finding many of our clients, taking up the contract compliance activity, if you like, more and more, because as you mentioned, traditionally the three-way matching was, once they considered, but has established itself for many, many years. And I guess where there's always been a bit of a disconnect is, okay, well, we can set up the PO, we can input the price and receive the invoice from the supplier. But things like embedded rebates, if there's any pricing, sort of options within the contract which you could leverage, and are you taking those? All of those things were going missed. So we've seen a huge increase in a lot of our clients, going beyond just the accounts payable audit and saying, well, actually, there could be more opportunity here to unlock the value if we, let's say, look at the contracts. And we do, audits which are what we consider, like, say, pricing audits, which doesn't really need to extend into the supplier side. You can really much do that by leveraging your own internal data. So I've had an example where I did an audit for a telecoms company where they had a contract in place. It was a 5-year deal, and they had a 10% reduction in their cost, sort of trade cost price year on year. And somebody in the procurement team didn't tell somebody in the P2P team who was raising the purchase orders to say, but by the way, on the anniversary, reduce the price list in the system by 10%, because that's what the contract says, and all POs from that point should be at a reduced rate. We picked it up 2.5 years into the contract, and I think the claim was around about $1 million in total, and we got about 980,000 back for our client. And obviously they were over the moon, but what it highlighted was there was a gap in the process where, although there was a three-way match, although there was a PO in place, and although invoices were being paid and processed, nobody ever detected that this contract had a sort of price mechanic of a reduced 10% year on year going through. So as I said, it's becoming more focused, and I suppose for AP managers, knowing that the opportunity for this can exist, and simply processing and paying an invoice is obviously fundamentally and really crucial, but actually, is that in compliance with the terms and conditions, what you've agreed with that supplier, I think, is a question mark. And if you can introduce that as an additional value stream, then I think it will be a good piece of PR and promotion work for yourselves.
Yeah, on their own, each of these initiatives are compelling, but it's when you get synergies across all three of these pillars that now you're able to really drive improvements in the source to pay process. And to tell us about that, I'll hand it back to VJ.
Thank you very much, Mark. So how do we get the synergies across the S2P? So as you've heard, there's a really strong link across all the pillars, and that is the foundational data that we collect up front, which means that once you have the data, you can really drive the value curve upward pretty quickly. And results can be as quick as 30 days from the accounts payable type of audit work. And then once the value begins to flow in, I think what most organizations find is that, quickly, a lot of stakeholders become champions and facilitators. And really, it helps you, drive adoption, and, the value seems to go up, within each of the different pillars. So that's kind of where we say the synergies are driving. And, it's a combination of short and long term. You'll see the axes, time across the bottom, value across the top. But I guess what the core message comes back to is that we really do leverage that data from the AP or from the ERP, the accounts payable side, to gain all the insights. Get all the let's say fast recoveries, traditionally like the duplicate payments and statement credits, etc., but using those insights then contribute as potential inputs or providers to, let's say, contract compliance, audit opportunities. So that question leads us on to what do we need to execute and get a successful outcome. So as we discussed a few minutes ago, data is the foundation and the investment upfront, which will lead to a strong return on investment over 3 pillars. At each level, we use the data to identify insights and value, and then the core data being the vendor master file and the AP transaction detail. And by making a few tweaks to this core data, we can incorporate payment terms and get access to the contracts database, which will really enable all 3 solutions to be self-sufficient to a significant degree. So the benefits of the 3-pillar approach: it will generate bankable cash and working capital in the shortest possible time frame. You can assess accuracy and diligence of the current payment process and compliance of suppliers to existing contracts and agreements, mitigate risks and reduce leakage in disbursement processes and supply contracts, establishing a sustainable and effective audit program going forward. You can also leverage provider expertise and best practices to establish a world-class compliance program. And some of this we see happening across more of our clients because, they've naturally started from, doing an accounts payable audit, and, having worked with them for, many years and as a long-term partner, we've been able to offer additional areas of value opportunity in areas such as DPO and contract compliance, which then helps us to, drive up more value for their organization. So on to some of the case studies. We've got 3 examples here from our partnerships. Firstly, a CPG organization, consumer products, an aerospace manufacturer, and a pharmaceutical and health organization. And with the CPG client, we actually began working for them solely in the UK. They wanted us to focus on an immediate need to generate cash. After the success of the first phase, we expanded geographically to deliver a global review. We visited most large country hubs to ensure that the stakeholders understood the processes and were comfortable that we could take care of their supplier relationships. As part of the process, we delivered root cause analysis and process improvement recommendations, highlighting a significant issue on calculation and collection of large rebates. We also assisted the client on a DPO program and advised on contract compliance. And so far, we've recovered over £55 million for that client. So the next example is an aerospace manufacturer where we've been working with them since 2005. Again, this is a global audit where we've delivered savings of over £20 million back to our client. And this is because we've had the foundational data, which I was talking about earlier. We were able to provide them with a data cleanse of their vendor master file, eliminating duplicate vendors and incorrect contact details. We also advised them on improving processes for handling large foreign currency VAT transactions and issues with their ERS and self-billing system. So this client is where they've invested a lot of automation and technology over the last few years, and we've been able to provide them with the security to know that whilst these transformations are occurring in their business, we've been keeping an eye on the processes for them. Finally, we can talk about our partnership with a large pharmaceutical and health organization. This was a global audit, again, where we provided a range of services under the 3-pillar approach, from audit through to the analytics. And during our partnership, we delivered over £65 million in cash back to the business. This involved identification of issues with technology platforms interfacing with their ERP system, working with their offshore BPO, and providing advice on our findings, performing ad hoc analytic projects, including responding to the UK government on payment practices. We're also a sole provider for all of their contract audit services, which has delivered over £17 million back in cash to their business, along with highlighting improvements to contracting to leading to even further contract value in the future. Back to you, Mark.
That brings us to our third and final poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. This time we want to know, which of the following best describes your top objective in the next 12 to 18 months? Do you want a fast track to cash? Do you want payment terms improvement? Are you looking for value leakage prevention and compliance? Or is there something else that's topping your list of objectives? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen. We'll discuss the results in just a moment. And if you identify something else as being your top objective, you've got a little extra work to do. We want you to use the chat tool to tell us what it is your objective is, so we can provide you with some advice. So what do you reckon it is over the next 12 to 18 months as businesses start to move toward the recovery that's going to be the top priority for them, Vijay?
I suppose, the last year has been, hasn't been easy for, globally for anybody, and that includes, your supplier relationships, the suppliers themselves in trying to, keep up their supply chain, to your organization, and even them guaranteeing their sort of supply chains down, further down, the chain as well. And I suppose, in all of this, the flow of cash and the movement of, cash in paying invoices on time, etc., has been crucial, if you like, and especially when, habits and, restrictions have put extra pressure, if you like, on organizations, and certainly sectors such as travel, tourism, food, entertainment, etc., have taken a big hit. And when you think about all of that, Mark, and all of the sort of the peripheral service sort of companies or services that maybe support all of those industries, everyone's had to pull a little bit harder, if you like. So I think it's all very short term, really, is to kind of get back onto I wouldn't say a cash positive, but certainly take a look at it and your processes, your internal sort of payment terms, etc., and what activities do you as AP managers or finance managers are doing within your organizations that you think, well, it's been tough, but how can I really ensure I'm delivering maximum value for my organization, and is what I've currently got working? Could I do more? Is there a better way to do it? So I think always taking a look and a review and revisiting. And one of the things that I've heard a lot of recently is the word pivot. There was always things which are established. We've always done things in the same way, and everyone's working in the same sort of mode, if you like. But certainly with COVID and having it such an impact in everybody's lives, has really meant we've had to pivot and look at a lot of things in different ways. And certainly there's no better time than any than to have a look at your current activities that you may be performing within your own sort of departments, if you like, or organizations, and say, well, am I doing enough? Is what I'm doing at the moment adequate or correct? And knowing what we've talked about here about the 3-pillar approach, have I really leveraged the most out of the opportunity from the data that we have residing within our organization to generate better value and more value, really? So rather than just looking at the simple duplicate payment, vendor credits, etc., what are we doing? Are we doing more? What more can we do? And I think this is where having a partner like us, with so many years of experience, we could really bring to the table a lot more opportunity.
We asked our attendees which of the following best describes your top objective for the next 12 to 18 months. By a country mile, it's payment terms improvement. 45% of our attendees said that tops their list of agenda. 25% of our attendees identified value leakage prevention and compliance as their top objective. 20% said fast track to cash, and 5% said it's something else. What's the single biggest piece of advice you'd give to our attendees today who have identified payment terms improvement as their top objective?
I mean, I think that's quite, I would say, an easy answer, Mark, but I think I would say just take action right now because, as I mentioned earlier, every day which is going by, where payment terms aren't being, let's say, scrutinized is, cash lost, for the business in terms of, working, capital improvement, if you like. So, really, the sooner the action you take, the quicker you're going to be able to, realize and recognize that value back for your organization. That's all I can probably add for the payment terms improvement. And I suppose, obviously, where do I start? How can we get it up and off the ground? What are the opportunities? How can we do an initial assessment? We can help you answer all of these questions, and I guess, having access to the data, and as I think we discussed earlier, there's kind of really two key files. Obviously, it's the vendor master file and the accounts or the payable transaction data, which allows to give you that visibility and insight into, what is currently happening and what could happen in terms of if you did that payment terms improvement against agreed terms. But there could also be, potential opportunity where you've got suppliers within, certain categories, whether they're by direct or indirect, where, you've got a whole variety of payment terms happening. And just looking at an analysis on that level, you could actually, generate a lot more opportunity in terms of improving payment terms. So,
What are the,
sorry, go on.
I was going to say, what are the key takeaways you want our attendees to have today?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think really to summarize, kind of we want to focus on the best approach to a project like this to ensure, that for your organizations that you can, maximum value can be delivered. So the key takeaways, a three-pillar approach can deliver access to working capital and provide a cash and P&L uplift. And, like we've said, stakeholder alignment is crucial, as is data availability. Don't rely on automated systems, as the human element of insight and experience coupled with data is the key. If I can say, Mark, the amount of times I may have heard in my 18 years in doing this, people have said, we have automated systems and things do this and things like that. But, yet today we still find opportunity and errors occurring within systems, and that's not because, they're being done, intently. It's just because of, things being overridden or, different sort of processes being introduced or occurring, which cause a bit of turbulence in, what might have happened, for a long period of time. Equivalent programs also, currently running have delivered value between 10 and 50 million over a three-year period. So it's definitely something worth looking at, I would say. And also, I suppose, engaging with a provider who can deliver in the shortest time frame. A provider with big data capabilities and a holistic approach to audit analytics, I think is key. And, our investment in technology, I think, if I may speak to that, we invest a huge amount of money in technology every year, recognizing that, organizations change, their data environments change. So we have to keep up to that, level of, being able to ingest that amount of data. And some of it is quite complex, in terms of how it's structured. So being able to quickly, adapt and adopt to that data, I think is really important. So having a provider that can do that is really key. And it's important to provide that has an experience in launching these large and complex programs, because, I suppose, I can't see who's on, the calls, but certainly if you think about your organization, how many, let's say if you're geographically spread, how many different, let's say, hubs you've got, how many, ERPs, processes may be happening at local levels. So really a provider that can really understand that true complexity of nature and being able to launch a program quickly without disrupting your critical business activities, I think is key as well, which we can help to do that. And I think an engaging a provider is capable to deliver, a long-term program of continuous improvement. And I suppose kind of this touches on a little bit about, traditional accounts payable audit, where most people, organizers perhaps have done it once, twice, change providers, etc. But, really looking at that data and what more can I do with that data? So, making these projects an ongoing part of your organization's best practice. Try and focus and identify and secure value, providing different strategies, to try and reduce the leakage. And also, driving historical, value is one thing by identifying, let's say, historical errors. But, looking forward into the future and say, well, how can I improve things going forward? Taking the insights, making them actionable, and looking at your source to pay sort of end to end. I think is really important as well. But also at the same time maintain their supplier relationships, which kind of brings on to the next point. That I suppose working with so many different global clients, and for many years, I think one of the things which which always crops up as a question is well, what about my supplier relationships? How will they be impacted? And I suppose working with a partner or provider who really understands that you own your supplier relationships, and we are a partner delivering you a service, and really keeping that front and center, I think is really important. To work with a supplier that is professional, ethical, and is understanding of your relationship with that supplier. And I guess the communications that that are sort of done as well with those suppliers, I think is really important. So I suppose they're the sort of the key takeaways that I could share from this. And I suppose, yeah, I'll hand it over back to you, Mark, for any Q&As, if you may have any.
Yeah, we're going to enter the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you haven't already submitted your question for VJ, or if you've thought of an additional question for VJ, go ahead and use the chat tool on your screen to submit them to us now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Our first question, an attendee wants to know, what advice can you give for organizations looking to benchmark their payment terms by different industries to determine where we can push for further net payable days or higher discounts? Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I guess one of the things that we, sort of are very careful of is maintaining, confidentiality. So, whilst perhaps we can't, and I know perhaps this wasn't the exact intent of the question, to say, how am I doing against a particular, let's say, not a competitor, but a provider, etc. But we can give you broad benchmarks, to say, well, there's, an improvement area here because we see that as the industry trend, etc. But certainly, yeah, there are opportunities to do that, and certainly where we see, perhaps from a category specific area, we could probably highlight, where there are opportunities to improve payment terms, perhaps down to that level, I would say.
Another question from an attendee. They write in that their top objective is to move from non-PO invoices to PO-based invoices. What advice could you give us to help accelerate that transition?
Again, introducing PO-based invoices, introduces more control to an organization. Having the opportunity to, I guess, requisition a PO and get that set up and then pay against it. In terms of how do you move quickly to that, I guess there's lots of software out there. If you've got an ERP system, it may have a PO a module within there already. If it hasn't, then perhaps have a look at what you're currently using as far as your your invoice system is concerned, and would it be a good time to to update or upgrade that to one which has an inbuilt PO system? Because if you think about it, they are connected in a way, payment and the PO side of the function as well. So yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, moving towards it, it would be more, I suppose, a holistic look at it to say, what else should I be upgrading or updating at the same time, rather than just moving from a non-PO to a PO process.
Another attendee writes, does your company have to be of a certain size to do these types of initiatives that you've just described?
I would say, I mean, thinking about the percentage of error rate that we identified, I mean, typically, with sort of PRGX, we like to obviously, bring and add value. And, we work with lots of different sizes and types of organizations. And, for us, being of a particular size and doing these initiatives, you would have to look at it from a cost value perspective and say, okay, well, to support this project and initiative, what's the return going to be for me as an organization? We could probably do like an initial assessment for you and to say, hey, here's who we are, here's our profile of spend. I guess we've had companies or clients that we worked with before where, that let's say they've been, I don't know, a brewery company, for example, where, a lot of their core spend is with core products, and very a third party spend. So, we look at, opportunities very carefully from that level. So on the face of it, what might look like, a significant amount of spend going through, when you really break it down and you say, well, let's say like an oil company, they're going to have some real big ticket spend items that they're going to have, and they'll be very carefully controlled and monitored. But once you take those out and you look at the, they say the true third party or indirect spend, which is traditionally where we find a lot of the errors and opportunity occurring, we'd probably, have a review and, we want to make sure that, we can deliver value for you from a program and a project that you're willing to support. And, if there's a way we can do that, we'll certainly help you to do that. And, we have, preventional software as well that we can, perhaps offer as well, if that needs to be, the case, if the opportunity isn't as presentable as we'd normally like to see.
Are there certain industries that are showing particularly strong interest in these types of initiatives?
As I said, traditionally companies where they've got a larger proportion of indirect spend or complex spend, if you like, with multiple product categories, etc., are typical. Ones where they've had lots of M&A activity and global sort of organizations where there's multiple processes or systems or ERPs in place, and sometimes where they're not all joined up. But even having said that, Mark, we've had, we work with the CPG organization that I touched on. They have a global SAP system, but they run them in 3 different hubs, and each one isn't connected. So when we've been doing an AP audit program for them, we've analyzed the data across all 3 different instances, and run analytics and algorithms against all the 3 different systems, and that's highlighted exposure in not just duplicate payments but multi-vendor accounts and issues, etc., and so on. So there's always opportunity there, even if you've got the same system but maybe implemented in global hubs.
Another attendee is wondering how they can be sure that they could derive value from these types of services.
So I suppose looking, thinking about your spend and what's going through, the systems. And I think the broad figures I got, 0.02% up to 0.08%, really is kind of also the bottom end. But if you've done a cleanse of your accounts payable system, typically then that's the kind of figures and the area of opportunity or error that could be identified in terms of value. So as a quick math, that could be one way to approach that. I guess the only sort of outliers or differences to that is organizations that have changed, transformed, let's say implemented different ERP systems, anything which has caused let's say a change to the norm to how it used to look before, I suppose, so when you've had updates or upgrades to your systems, that can cause a bit of a disruption. And as I was mentioned earlier about acquisitions, if you've acquired companies have merged together, these things can cause, let's say, turbulence, if you like, from what would be the normal state of condition. And I suppose other area as well, if I may just add on to that, is if you gone from an in-source to an outsource model, that migration itself can cause errors to creep in, and the other way around as well. So a multitude really. So yeah, I would say anything which has caused change or disruption is really a good area to sort of focus and look on.
And that will be our final word. Thank you so much, Vijay, for an excellent presentation and for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jovi. Ms. Jovi.
Thank you, Mark. So that's all the time we have for today's program. I just have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we officially close out. If you could please fill out the short evaluation form that will appear once you close the webinar. This will help us better serve your needs in future webinars. As a reminder, the on-demand materials will be emailed to everyone within 2 business days. This will include a PDF of the slides as well as a link to the recording of today's presentation. Thank you again to Mark and Vijay for a great presentation today, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. This webinar was brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by PRGX. Thank you all and have a great day.